I've got a question for you. What would you do if I said to you, we really all need to fight climate change? Tell me your plan to completely decarbonise the way you and your household lives. Probably you'd come back to me with a plan to electrify everything over, say, 10 years, including your home and your car. Although you'd probably tell me you can't be 100% certain of meeting the electrification target because of the expense involved. And you'd probably acknowledge that your plan doesn't deal with your other emissions that aren't related to your energy use. Emissions like your holiday flights, for example. But the thing is, climate change is not a crisis that's 10 years away. It's already well and truly got its foot in the door. So those residual emissions over the next decade that are linked to how each of us lives or to how each business operates, they matter a lot. And we need to start dealing immediately with them. And it's possible to do that, but we can't do it by ourselves. We need to pay others to do some decarbonisation on our behalf. Not necessarily a huge amount of money, but something. Hello and welcome to Track Changes. I'm Murray Griffin from communications consultancy Earthed. And today we're going to talk with a very impressive guest about one way we can provide that investment in comprehensive decarbonisation, which is through the use of carbon credits. Michaela Morris is the recently appointed Chief Executive of Tasman Environmental Markets, known as TEM. Before that, she headed program delivery at Climateworks, which is Australia's most prestigious climate change policy think tank. And before that, she worked with consultancy and thesis, providing hands-on help to companies in sectors including agriculture, energy, real estate, and banking. And as you'll hear, Michaela is no stranger to international climate negotiations either. At their core, carbon credits work like this. An organisation undertakes an activity that results in greenhouse gas emissions being reduced or avoided at a level that is beyond business as usual. Maybe it's planting native trees. Maybe, as you'll hear, it's giving poor people in developing countries clean, efficient cook stoves, so they burn less wood, which reduces greenhouse gas emissions and also means they don't fill their homes with dangerous wood smoke. Once those credits are earned, another business or organisation, which either wants to or has to take a greater level of action to fight climate change than it can achieve in-house, then buys those credits on carbon credit markets and retires them. And those sales of the credits fund the continuation and expansion of activities that reduce or avoid emissions, while also demonstrating that the buyer of the credits is committed to taking ambitious action. I can't think of a better guide than Michaela to take us on a deep dive into the world of carbon credits. As Michaela says, there's no evidence that we can raise the amount of money that we need to raise to successfully fight climate change without using carbon market mechanisms. Michaela also points out there's now a high level of international agreement on what constitutes best practice in earning and buying carbon credits. Okay, let's go to my chat with Michaela. Hello, Michaela, and welcome to Track Changes.
Hi, Murray. Thanks for having me.
Can I ask you first up to give us a bit of background on yourself and your career? And could you also tell me what you're most proud of in your career so far?
Well, I'm originally from Germany, and I've been in Australia for close to a decade now and lived overseas before that, in various countries in the Gulf, Africa. And I started with the goal of influencing politics and behaviors and opinions, and then ended up falling in love with climate science in my late 20s, and have been really lucky because it's been a very multidisciplinary career, and no two roles are ever the same. I joined Tasman Environmental Markets as CEO last month. TEM is a leading carbon solutions provider and project developer in the Asia Pacific. And well, if I look back at my career and where it's taken me, I would struggle to use the term proud, because that would imply that any of this has been yet my achievement or that I had a master plan. But I feel utterly lucky that I've been able to, work across diverse roles with seriously talented people across many countries. I think I've counted 6 countries in 3 continents the other day.
Right.
And also various industries, like everything from the private sector, government, academia. And along the way, I've picked up really, it's almost like I got to collect really passionate and determined people.
Yes.
Our line of work typically attracts that, people are good value. They are in it for the right thing. And I'm still in, exchange with colleagues that I met in Lebanon when I was working in waste management, or people in the UN system. I get to see them most years at the COP and the climate change conferences. And also for my consulting days on Climateworks, like people go on to do exciting other jobs and you cross paths again and again, and you create this beautiful network of, just interesting people.
Yes, and that passion and that intelligence that you mentioned, it certainly does characterise people in this sector. So it's clear from your background that you've had an amazing career so far. What made you decide that taking on the chief executive role at TEM should be your next move?
I suppose 2 things. One is the topic. I tend to joke that, resource management, waste management was my first love, and then carbon markets was my second.
Yes.
And then TEM itself was, I tend to pick roles for the people I get to work with and how much remit I have to make an impact. And TEM really ticked both boxes. So I've known lots of the team members for a long time. I've worked with them when I was in consulting. TEM was our offset provider. They helped us structure carbon portfolios for clients. So I knew a lot of the people already. And then TEM's also really uniquely positioned in Australia. I don't think there's many organizations like it because we have end-to-end integration from, all the way from project development to project management to then the ability to structure portfolios and interact directly with the clients and do that across the Asia Pacific. So can really support businesses of any size with their decarbonisation goals. And what I'm hoping to be able to is be really catalytic in rising climate ambition altogether.
Yes. Now, I'm sure when you're out and about, you get asked lots of questions about carbon credits. What are the most common things that you get asked, and how do you respond?
So carbon credits are arguably a really tricky concept to wrap your head around. There's so much to it, and people often have preconceptions. So I'd say if you narrow it down to one, the most common question and probably the most interesting one isn't it, don't carbon credits just give large emitters a permission to continue emitting or business as usual? And I understand the impression and the logic, but what I always respond is like, you've got it the wrong way around. Carbon projects themselves do not prevent companies to reduce their emissions. They don't make them anything. The lack of ambition, the lack of urgency, or lack of compliance pressures makes businesses choose not to be ambitious in climate action and reduce their emissions. So it's really the flip side around. And if you look at research, it suggests that voluntary carbon buyers are more likely than non-buyers to have climate change targets. Their targets tend to be more ambitious, and they're also by a factor of 3.4 more likely to have approved science-based climate targets. That gold standard of emission reduction targets where you align yourself with a carbon budget. So I think the rationale doesn't stack up, but I understand where the fear or the concern comes from.
Yep.
And I also a sense of the core of these concerns is the kind of flawed logic that if we only did not have carbon projects, we see more absolute reductions. There is no evidence to support that. In fact, there's actually plenty of evidence that is the exact opposite. In Australia, we have a beautiful lived experiment a decade ago where the only time national emissions actually went down in a meaningful way was during the times of the carbon credit scheme under the Galah government. And there's various reasons for that, and you could talk about that probably for hours. But in a nutshell, carbon markets or market mechanisms like carbon markets are policy tools. And if they're designed well, they allow us just to be more efficient when we deploy capital. So you can basically get more abatement for less money and time and resources. And they also allow us for more flexibility, between periods of time, so year to year, and also between companies. So there's a lot of clever things that carbon markets can do and carbon credits can do that actually lead to more ambition, not less, if you ask me.
Yeah. What would you say to someone who said, okay, we don't need carbon credits though, because companies should just electrify everything and use renewable energy. What's your response to that sort of comment?
Well, really short, and to borrow from improv here, yes, and yes, please do all of that. But Paris-aligned pathways shows a really narrow window to address the climate crisis.
Yeah.
And we can't afford to create those like false dichotomies and choices. Like, is it mitigation or is it adaptation? Is it emission reductions or investments in removals? Like, we need an absolute combination of everything to tackle the climate crisis. And, to former colleagues of mine at Climateworks, put an article in the conversation last year. It was titled "Everything, Everywhere, All at Once."
Yes.
And I think that's so spot on. Like, why would you leave anything on the table, considering the urgency? And carbon projects are one tool in the box. They're by far not the only tool, and they can never be the only tool, but they are a really important tool. And secondly, and this is where economics come in. The transition to net zero will require so much capital, like enormous amounts of public and private climate finance. I think Bloomberg Energy Finance puts the figure at 5.6 trillion a year from now till 2030, just to have any chance to stay within Paris Agreement bounds. That's so much money. That's so much money. The COP negotiations have focused heavily on it.
Yes.
And if carbon markets are one policy instrument that is available to us, that has been proven to be effective, that allows us for more efficient allocation of capital, so we get to do more with less money, then we need to use that. And secondly, it also allows us to spread and share that monumental task, because you can disconnect the actual emissions at source from the financial commitments, based on criteria you choose. So you can choose historic responsibility, ability to pay, like what's cost effective, rights to development of developing countries. So it just allows you to be a lot more flexible on who transitions and who pays for the transition. And I think you can't really do it without it.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any evidence that says that we can deploy that amount of climate finance without using market mechanisms.
No, I've never seen anything like that, and I don't expect to either. Recently, there's been some very negative media coverage of carbon credits and carbon markets. So just imagine a journalist calls you up and says, "I'm about to write an article about carbon credits and markets. I don't know that much about them. I need to get my bearings." What would you say to them that you think are important points to keep in mind?
Well, carbon markets have always attracted scrutiny, and so they should.
Yes.
I've spent my whole career working on and advocating for more and faster and more robust climate action. And I think debate on, the governance, the methodologies, use cases, really improves overall integrity and makes everything better in this space. And also, just coming straight out of academia recently, I just love it that two minds can look at the same evidence and then draw very different conclusions. And this is it's by design. It's not a defect. It's part of the the battle of ideas, I suppose. What I have worried though in the recent debate is how the debate has been conducted. So it feels like we're pitting ideas and people against each other. It's made about those false dichotomies and choices. As I said, the reasoning being like, if we only had less carbon projects, we would have more direct action. I don't think that's true, and that's just misleading.
Yes.
And then also, some of the reasoning has been some carbon projects don't do what they say, so we get rid of them all, and then we will have more climate action. I don't see that working either.
No, and it is frustrating, I think. It's, yeah.
Yeah. If you look at the criticism about the human-induced regeneration method, that has now been unfolding for a number of years, a lot of that has actually led to some really good reforms and some better ground truthing in the verifications and has made everything better. So I think we should focus on improving something that already works instead of tearing it down.
Yeah. Absolutely.
There's a lot that's working. There's a lot of good to be done here. And I also feel like at the end of the day, there's more than everyone can agree on than we actually disagree on.
I wanted to ask you about, some people who argue that the only legitimate option is to go for real zero. And they're dismissive of the whole concept of reaching net zero, in part with the use of carbon credits. What are your thoughts on real zero?
Oh, it's a great term, isn't it? How could you not get on board with real zero? If you go back to first principles, it almost seems like the only logical approach. I'll tell you in a second why I think there's flaws in it, but let's just unpack that for a second. Because if you want to hold and ultimately reverse climate change, we just need to stop introducing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It's like if you don't turn off the tap, everything you do to stop the bath from overflowing is just tinkering around the edges. So
yes,
I don't think that's really debated. And the majority of these greenhouse gases actually comes directly from the combustion of fossil fuels. I think it's roughly around the 70% globally. So if you think this through, so phasing out of the use of fossil fuel is the single biggest lever we have. And, we've seen that hotly debated at various COPs. So, and then at face value, that's what real zero suggests. No, you just stop introducing fossil fuels in the atmosphere. So the intent, I can totally get on board with the intent, but I believe that there's a flaw in the logic that actually might hold us back. And I also disagree that the net in net zero is an issue. So if you think about real zero, it serves organizations really well that have readily available, commercially viable interventions at hand, mostly those with, energy-related direct and indirect emissions, because they can just switch to renewables. Right? It's often already, cost competitive, if not cheaper. But the single focus on these operational emissions then does, in turn, it disregards the interconnectedness of global supply chains. So it absolves organizations from the accountability for the emissions down their value chain. If you process the processing of raw materials, for example, like iron ore, because you only look at the operational emissions, you no longer look at the full value chain.
Yeah.
It misses the other 30% of emissions that are not fossil fuel based. So, those mostly non-carbon dioxide emissions from land use and process emissions and so forth. And developing these solutions will take time. It will take money. It can't be done today. So you have a whole cohort of organizations that have emissions in this space that for them, real zero is not an option. If you give them as the marching order, they might as well put the tools down. And then thirdly, it also absolves or excludes a large number of businesses where emissions are actually just in the supply chain. You tell them you're not playing a role here. They're going for real zero. As long as you're not having any operational emissions, you're off the hook. So I think you can, if you play real zero out through the economy, you can really perversely end up in a situation where you have less businesses focusing on high ambition, climate action, where you stifle transition to alternative business models because of the supply chain triggers, and where you have the weird outcome that a coal producer could be considered fully real zero because they can, operationally there can be no emissions in the extraction of the product, and give them full license to extract fossil fuels. Yeah. Because then you no longer consider the emissions that occur further down the supply chain in the combustion of their product. So if you get hung up on the net versus the real, in my view, net reflects complex realities and practical challenges that we have in this transition. That we need to claw back emissions later down the second half of the century. That we need negative emissions, and then real zero, I worry, just cuts us off unnecessarily and dogmatically from tools such as carbon markets, where we can maximize cost efficiency, we can distribute the burden. I cannot imagine any evidence that this would actually lead to more climate ambition. I'd actually suspect it would lead to less. But
yeah, I absolutely agree. And when I always think, well, show me a company that's got a sort of fully articulated plan to get to real zero, because I haven't seen one. And I think that's a real problem. If you're saying, we can only accept real zero, and no one's actually done it, or, has a plan to do it even, a full plan, people can have it as a goal. But if they haven't got a full plan, I think it's time to stop and take a breath and say, well, is this really what we want? And the other thing I would say, you talked about fossil fuels, that it is absolutely true, as the real zero advocates have said, that we need to exit fossil fuels. And I think there is widespread support across people who back real zero and people who, basically recognize that a net zero approach is what's required. There is widespread support, I think, for starting to plan immediately for how we exit fossil fuels, in a way that's rapid, but not doesn't cause huge amounts of harm to to people who work in those industries or who depend on that energy. So,
there's legitimate equity considerations here as well. But also everything's connected. No one operates in a vacuum. So I'd be surprised if you could point to the business today that is not in some form or shape reliant on other organizations that themselves, rely somewhat on fossil fuels.
Yes.
It's a timing question. We definitely need to get there. I think the point I'm trying to make is we need a plan and we need to consider the practicalities and the realities.
Yes.
And netting it off and negative emissions are a really important lever there.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I hope you're enjoying the chat so far. Just a reminder that Track Changes is a labour of love at the moment. If you're interested in sponsoring some episodes, you can contact me at murray@earthed.au. Let's say that there's a company or organisation listening in and they've just been completely convinced that they should be using carbon credits as part of their response by what you've said. What's your advice to them about what's the right way to use carbon credits? And, is there a wrong way to use them?
Well, if you had this conversation, probably 3-5 years ago, it could be a bit more of a debate. But at the moment, where we're now, there is just a high degree of agreement on what constitutes best practice. You can look at the initiatives like the science-based target initiatives, beyond value chain mitigation guidance. There is, the voluntary carbon markets initiative claims code of practice. There's references in, transition plan task force materials and so forth. So there's a lot of materials out there and a lot of initiatives that thought about this long and hard. And the agreement typically coalesces around two key areas, other than, the type of credit and the integrity question that we talked about.
Yeah.
And those areas are what do you use carbon credits for? And then what role do they play in your wider strategy? So if you look at the first point, what are carbon credits meant to be used for is first, fundamental is that you set and follow a science-based emission reduction target that's appropriate for your sector and your region, and you have a credible transition plan. So that's the foundation. You need that. There's no point of using carbon credits if you don't have, that fundamental element in place. And then carbon credits are then reserved for one of four things, in my opinion. One's obviously, residual emissions in the net zero target year. So after you've reduced your absolute emissions in line with science and your carbon budget, that bit at the end that cannot be abated, that's where you likely use carbon credits.
Yes.
The other area is, you go voluntarily above and beyond in your operational emission reductions in any given year. So do more. To make that voluntary, don't deduct that from your pathway, but do more. The third one would be invest in carbon dioxide removal, because we need to scale up demand so we can catalyze all these technologies, bring down cost curves, so we can suck down greenhouse gas emissions from the air at the time when we need them. So the Science-Based Target Initiative is currently looking at introducing neutralization targets into the new corporate net zero standard that's being developed and released later this year, because it acknowledges that ultimately we will have to claw back a lot of emissions that we've already, or global warming that we've already baked into the trajectory. And then fourthly, as a former greenhouse gas accountant and consultant, a company can do everything right and reduce emissions in line with science. But in any given year, there's ups and downs, the lumpy bits that just happen in the real economy. Like you sell more product or you acquire emissions intensive competitor, I don't know. And carbon credits can help you instead of just letting your target lapse and not achieving it that year, it can help you tie over and make good on that overshoot, and then just buy your time to make up for it in a subsequent year. So overall, you stay still within your carbon budget, and you're not deducting the carbon credit from it, but it just it gives you an ability to deal with those ups and downs.
Yes, you mentioned a few things there. You mentioned the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and two organisations. I always get them mixed up: VCMI and ICVCM.
Yep. Yes,
I wish they had names that were a bit more different. I will drop explanations of those into the show notes, but basically the SBTI is about setting expectations for what companies should do to align with climate change science in terms of emissions reduction, whereas the other two are about integrity, and they're basically global standards on integrity from both the perspective of the supplier of carbon credits and the buyer and the user of those credits. And so those are all very important organizations. But just briefly on the SBTI again, because we do want people to set science-based targets, but I think one very crucial point which you alluded to there is actually we want companies to go further than that, because we do have all these historical emissions in the atmosphere, and because not every company is going to, not every company is going to have a science-based standard. So we want those that do embrace that requirement for ambitious action. We want them to go further. Is that a correct sort of summary?
Yeah, 100%. Even for companies that do not have a science-based target in place, that it's something that is additional voluntary climate action. It achieves outcomes. But interestingly, the Science-Based Target Initiative released a paper last year, or a framework last year, around the beyond value chain mitigation guidance, and that's something I think has not got nearly enough attention and rep as it would have deserved.
Yes,
it got gobbled up in all the subsequent.
I have to say, I think that's
turmoil.
partly because it's called Beyond Value Chain Mitigation. It's not the title that a sort of plain English editor would choose. But yes, tell us a bit about that.
It's not snappy, no.
It's not a headline. It's not headline material. It is very important. Tell us a bit about that and give us your perspective on it.
Yeah, and that ties back to what I said. We need to think about what kind of role carbon projects can play in your wider climate change strategy. And so the framework that the SBTI released last year basically introduces the concept of thinking of carbon projects and investments along those lines as corporate climate finance, as opposed to offsetting. So you're not netting it off, but you're considering it as your own financial contribution to tackling the climate crisis. And the way it works is, as you are decarbonizing in line with the carbon budget and you're following your emission reduction pathway, you should also look at the residual emissions in any given year. So your footprint in any given year, multiply that with a shadow carbon price, and then consider that your annual corporate climate finance commitment. So hypothetical example, you have 1,000 tonne in this financial year. You multiply that by a $30 Aussie carbon price, so your climate finance commitment is $300,000. Now, what you do here really cleverly is you no longer make it about the tons, but about the unit is no longer the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent or greenhouse gases. It becomes the dollar, and that allows you to be a lot more creative and catalytic in the way you deploy that. So the guidance says use half of that to fund near-term quantifiable outcomes. So initiatives that will reduce emissions or remove emissions this decade and allow us to halve emissions by 2030. So in essence, carbon projects. And the other half, think about how you use that to drive additional finance into scaling up climate solutions. So, anything that can unlock, systemic transformations that we need to achieve mid-zero, so longer term. So research and development into your product, for example. How can you make this be less emissions intensive further down in your value chain? You could work with your supply chain, on reducing emissions there, like an insetting concept, but without having to make it into credits or go through the trouble of measuring it in terms of tons of emissions, because the unit is the dollar. Or you could even be as abstract and creative as using it for adaptation. So fund a seawall in a community you're serving, or so forth. So it allows you a bit more. It allows you to be more creative, and I think that's where it gets really interesting. And I see that gaining more traction over the years.
Yes, there does seem to be a bit of a coalescing of support for that concept, I think. Is that correct? Yeah. There are lots of different types of carbon credits on offer. What's your advice to companies and organisations on how to choose credits, how to choose the credits that are right for them?
Well, it can be a minefield. I think anyone that has been in this position knows what I'm talking about. I think what I've found to be true again and again is that you will need expert support. Advice is just really critical, whether that's someone in-house or external, like your consultant or your carbon credit provider. There's just a lot of detail that you need to be aware of, and experts really can help you navigate a lot of those complexities. I think you'd be well advised to have a laser focus on integrity. Make sure that the units, they need to do what they say they're doing.
Yes.
There's virtually no point in investing in any credit that has no integrity. Like there's better ways of using money. And then think about not just climate. So a lot of those carbon projects, as I said before, are almost like covert sustainable development project, or can be. So if you think about your carbon project portfolio, think about what are your broader sustainability commitments, your broader ESG commitments as a company, and how can the carbon credits you choose support that and really be aligned with that broader strategy. And then I think lastly, obviously, due diligence is absolutely fundamental. When I joined TEM, I knew about the due diligence process from the outside before, but I was really pleased to find a really robust framework where we look at aspects like additionality, permanence, leakage checks. We check if this is the best practice methodology for any in situ application. We look at legal reviews, reputational risks. We check for the impacts beyond carbon and so forth. So you really want to put your projects through the ringer, and then not only take that from an external party, but then take all of that due diligence advice and take that back and stress test it yourself.
Yes.
And I have to say, companies have gotten so much more sophisticated with that as well. Like if we had this conversation 5 years ago, I feel like probably a lot of that would have gone over people's heads. But the kind of questions we get asked now are so much more sophisticated and mature, and they're a good sign.
That is good. And I like that phrase, so you have to put your project through the ringer, because basically if you don't, somebody else will. So, it is, as is their right. And so it is important that people do that. As well as, once they've chosen their carbon credits, they've worked out how they're going to use them, they're using them appropriately, they've chosen good quality credits that match, their various other needs. Companies are also under increasing pressure to report on their climate change actions. How should companies talk to the public about their use of carbon credits? What sort of information should they include in their communications?
A lot of it is covered by, some of the guidance frameworks that we mentioned previously, the ICBCM, and here in Australia also the ACCC.
Yes.
There's some good guidance out there. And I think what I want to put up front, and this has always been my advice, if you use carbon credits, just don't net them off. Itemize everything separately. It just it does the same thing, but it just removes so much problems from the get-go and so much misunderstanding.
Can you expand on that? So what you mean by don't net them off, just list them separately?
Yeah. So if and this brings us back to in any given year, you will have a residual footprint, even if you decarbonize in line with science and in line with your with your share of the carbon budget. Even let's assume you're decarbonising in line with your with a science-based target, in line with the carbon budget. In any given year, you have those residual emissions that we talked previously.
Yes.
And if you go above and beyond and you deploy climate finance, you want to buy credits and go above and beyond your operational reductions. One is not equivalent to the other, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others. And I think you're just diluting your the power of your voluntary additional contribution and the financial commitment if you say, I take one off the other, because they're not equivalent.
Okay, so report them separately. Talk about your actual emissions and then your investments in carbon credits or other climate change initiatives. That's your advice.
Yes, and I mean we see that with avoided emissions as well. There's a lot of emerging carbon accounting guidance that it's a matter of transparency ultimately, because we're assuming sometimes mathematically they can be equivalent. If you emit something here and you take something away there, then in theory it nets each off. But they're just different in type, and I think it dilutes the integrity and your commitment if you just net them off. So there's a lot of power in just itemizing it separately, explaining what you're doing. Explain any headline claims that you're making.
Yes.
Give context. And then there's obviously, as I said before, there's other principles for the VCMI's principles for climate mitigation claims credibility, where you be transparent, be traceable, so be true and verifiable, make them accurate, be conservative, always really important, relevant, don't mislead, informative, and make sure that set the right incentives for the target audience. So there's a lot more to it. But if if we want to boil it down to one thing, is just make it as representative of the truth as you possibly can.
Yeah, that's good advice. So companies are, as well as dealing with their own emissions, they're increasingly being asked to take action or support action that results in their customers and their suppliers reducing their emissions. What role can carbon credits have in that task?
And that brings us, straight into the question of value chain emissions. That is so tricky. So just for background here, obviously, when you're talking about value chain, it's the upstream supply emissions, what goes into your products and processes, but it's also often downstream, for example, emissions from your product use and so forth. And the key feature of those Scope 3 emissions is that you have an element of accountability because, they're generated because of the choices you make. You design the product, you make procurement choices, you choose your transport provider and so forth. But often you also have a limited ability to control those. And that's a chasm that's really hard to, wrap your head around it.
Yes.
But what I found again and again is that if you do not consider those Scope 3 emissions and value chain emissions, you're not really it doesn't really make for holistic and really robust climate action. I've seen that as a consultant when creating science-based emission reduction targets. The Scope 3 component was always the peskiest and the hardest.
Yeah.
And scared off a lot of companies, but it really did a lot of good to think about, business transformation, your choices. It has a real powerful lever in moving us to a lower carbon economy. In fact, it's actually so challenging that the SBTi is now looking at how can they operationalize that better in the upcoming update of the corporate net zero standard. But that's a separate topic. And then I would say, so now that you've you've outlined the challenge of your value chain emissions, I'd say they are one of the prime applications for the concept of corporate climate finance that we discussed earlier. So this is really where carbon credits can help your network and yourself channeling climate finance into high integrity projects that have an impact now, and therefore dealing with that accountability and retaking some of the control. So that can be really tricky for some organizations that have really large and complex networks of suppliers. And there's solutions on the market that are dealing or trying to deal with that. And TEM has just launched last month our own digital marketplace called TEM Online Enterprise, which is in essence a bespoke risk managed platform where you enable your supply chain to invest in a portfolio of carbon projects that you pre-approved, you run due diligence, they're aligned with all the other core benefits, the sustainable development and biodiversity core benefits, for example, that are important to your organization, and therefore allow you to align your supply chain's climate commitment with yours. So it's something we're trialing and rolling out, and it's going to be interesting to see what the interest is.
Yeah, that does sound good. If you send me a link, I'll drop it into the show notes. Can I ask you, how has your thinking about carbon credits and carbon markets evolved over the years? Or has it been pretty much the same for quite some time now?
I think everything evolves in this space.
Yes.
But usually it's an evolution rather than a revolution, and things tend to build on each other. So it's, I think that's a key feature of the whole sector. There are two themes that I've found to be true again and again over the years. One is that carbon markets don't have a mind of their own. Like often we're like, there's some malicious intent or there's some inherent flaw. It's carbon markets are just as good or as bad or as effective or defective as we design them. And that has implications for the projects, obviously. So you need to be really careful to design for the outcomes you want so you don't get any perverse outcomes. And I would say we probably didn't get that quite right in really early iterations of the clean development mechanism, if you recall, or even the early European Union emissions trading scheme. There were some real challenges with baselines and allowances and so forth.
Yes.
And then the second thing is, I also don't think carbon markets are really powerful in some areas, but that not everything can be dealt with by carbon markets or by even pricing emissions. Some things just need to be legislated or regulated. Like in a country like Australia, you should not be able to log native forests. You should not be able to vent landfill gas. That should be just not permitted. And carbon markets are not the right tool for the job there.
Let's look ahead. You've talked about how your thinking has evolved. Let's look ahead. How do you expect carbon markets themselves to evolve over, say, the next 2 or 3 years? In what ways do you want them to be different? And what factors do you think will determine whether carbon markets evolve in the way that you think they should?
I wish I had a crystal ball, to be honest.
Yeah.
There are a couple of themes that I picked up at the last COP that really struck me, and probably more than any other COP I've attended, that I felt like we're a bit of a precursor of where carbon markets might be going. There was a lot of discussion around insurance. So, mechanisms, how do you pool the delivery and the financial risk of projects? And that could be just, typical insurance, the classical insurance products, but also just by banding together various projects and sharing the risk and, mechanisms that to deal with that.
Yes.
I thought that was really interesting. There were conversations around, more transparency on the climate outcomes and core benefits and financial flows of projects, and how to make that available, publicly available. Like, unfortunately, it's better now than it used to be, but there's still not enough transparency in all of this. One of the things I picked up on was the Global Carbon Market Utility was working on data transparency, for example, for contracts, audits, verification, dispute resolution. And then once you have, that kind of infrastructure, you really enable financial intermediaries like banks or insurance companies to enter the market, provide project financing, and, house risk for end buyers. So I think that could be a game changer. There was some talk around risk-adjusted claims, which I thought was intriguing.
What are they?
Yeah. So you basically take an overly conservative view, and you also think about the issue of equivalency between projects, the whole mechanisms of the carbon cycle.
Yes.
And then you decide what a risk-adjusted view is. Then maybe 1 ton of my emissions should be equivalent to 3 carbon credits, for example.
Yes.
So you kind of adjust in the way you purchase and use them.
That's an interesting idea. I mean, I have seen companies, or I have seen one company that was, it bought, I think it was 1.5 times the number of credits that it thought matched its sort of residual emissions in a particular year, which I thought was a good approach because it brings in that conservatism. Of course, it's a bit rough and ready, but it does bring in that conservatism in a way, and maybe alludes to that issue of equivalency as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's conservatism built into a lot of the methodologies, obviously.
Yes.
But what it does, it gives the company the control over some of that conservacy.
Yeah. Okay. Can you give me a couple of examples of projects that you find particularly inspiring, either TEM projects or other projects that you know of, and can you tell me why you find them particularly inspirational?
When I look at carbon projects, I look at, it's the methodology and the execution. So methodology is, what are you doing? How robust is it? What's the outcome? And then the execution is how you're doing it. What does it look like on the ground? Does it make people's lives better? Like really, really simple first principles questions. And as you can imagine and probably heard of, there's a wide spectrum out there. I don't think that's disputed.
Yes.
With TEM itself, we have some owned and managed projects across the APAC region that really inspire me. So we have local land managers in southwest Queensland that are looking after projects there for us. We've got a team of 30 currently deploying a project in Papua New Guinea, and they're all very knowledgeable, passionate. It makes for really impactful outcomes. The Papua New Guinean project is really interesting because it's an improved cookstove project in the Southern Highlands. We've already deployed 20,000 cookstoves to communities, and the team was just there last week for the verification audit and sent back pictures of people with using the stoves, really engaging with it. For someone that has spent so much of their career on so far removed from project implementation, that's a real that gets me really excited. It gets the team really excited, and it's beautiful to watch.
Yes, I'm sure it would be. But maybe if you could explain a bit, I guess, how a clean cookstove project works and what the benefits are, both in terms of health and in terms of abating greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, I think more simply is we're coming at the angle, obviously, the way to pay for the rollout of more efficient and cleaner cookstove is through the carbon credits. So, the principle is there's traditional cooking methods in those communities that are typically either wood or briquette based. They're open fires indoors. They create a lot of air pollution. They require they're collecting a lot of firewood, so they lead to deforestation, and so there's environmental downsides from it. And if you replace these cookstoves with improved cookstoves that are burn more efficiently, cleaner, you free up a lot of the time of typically women and children to collect firewood, save up, creating health benefits and creating time benefits and financial benefits to the communities, and also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the nifty thing here is you use the carbon credit income of these projects to pay for the cookstoves. But what I personally find almost more important, funny to say for someone in my line of work, is what it does to the community. So it's almost like a sustainable development project that just happens to have a carbon benefit. So you get the credits to pay for the outcomes, and that gets me really excited.
Yes, certainly the benefits are significant. Okay, just one last question, Michaela, and it's not at all about carbon credits and carbon markets, or it needn't be. It can be if you want. What fact do you wish was more widely known, because it would help us understand what we need to do to move faster to a cleaner, greener future?
I think we need to rethink this. We need to rethink the challenge as a disruption. I feel like with AI and all of that coming, we started using that vocabulary, but ultimately what we're looking at is that we radically need to transform the way we run economies, we run, businesses, the way we produce things, the way we make energy. It's not just incremental change won't get us there. We really need to acknowledge this is a disruption. We need to come up with business models that do not even exist, with industries that do not even exist. I think the companies or the organizations that will fare very well will understand that really early and set themselves up for success and go down that pathway. And those that don't will, die whilst incrementally improving.
That's a good response. And I like your use of the word disruption there, because personally, I do feel that the word transition has become a bit of a weasel word, because what we are faced with, what we need to do, it sort of transition sounds like something, you can, spend however long it takes. But because of the disruptions that we face from climate change, unfortunately, we're at a point where, there's probably likely to be disruption as we try to head off that terrible sort of catastrophic effect. And we will need to find ways to manage that disruption. Do you think that's the case?
That is exactly what I'm thinking. I love the word weasel, weasel term. It sounds tame. Transition sounds tame, no? You need something more forceful.
Yes, and it's not something. It's not a sort of wording point that that I think you or I would argue with any pleasure, because it would have been great if we could just say, we need a transition, but we were sort of too slow off the blocks for that to happen. Michaela, that's been a wonderful chat. I've really enjoyed it, and thanks so much for your wonderful insights.
So did I, Marie. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please rate it and share it. See you next time.